We now present For the Record.
Welcome to For the Record. I'm Will Keneally. We're joining you from the Capitol this morning as we wrap up our election coverage after this week's election, a race in which Liberals retain their majority on the bench, and they'll do so until 2028. At least that is the next time a Liberal seat will be up on the ballot. But before that, we'll have another judicial race on the ballot next spring that will see the other Bradley, conservative Justice Rebecca Bradley, on the ballot. That's a spring election that will also set up Wisconsin for the midterms and gubernatorial elections later that fall. A lot to get through, and breaking all of that down with us is Brandon Scholes, and thanks so much for joining us.
Good to see you, Will.
Yeah, so I want to kind of take viewers back to what we were going through in our heads on election night. As we were starting to see the numbers unfold, what were you thinking?
Yeah, even before election night, we might have had some sense that this election might be a little different just because of early voting, absentee voting, higher than it was in 2023. And we looked at those maps that Joe Handrick and Charles Franklin put together about early voting and what it meant. And it really was more than what we've ever seen. But on election night, when the results started to roll in early, I think a lot of people just stood back and went, "Ho. This is not quite what we thought was going to happen." We thought it'd be a late night. We thought we'd see Milwaukee counted late. We were watching 4 or 5 different places in the state to see how both candidates did, not only against 2023, but against the 24 presidential elections too. So it was quite a night of results rolling fast, and the race was called by 9:40 or so.
Yeah, on a spectrum from, we saw Tammy Baldwin's, I think, 2018 race called immediately as the polls were closed, a foregone conclusion that she was going to win, to, a 3 a.m. Election call that we saw maybe last November. This was kind of that middle ground in a weird way that at least I was not expecting, certainly. And going back to looking at Waukesha, for example, right, seeing those numbers where a candidate like Brad Schimel has to meet certain numbers, Crawford has to meet certain numbers in Waukesha and Dane counties, for example. Anywhere specific in the state that you certainly had your eye on along the way as well?
There were a couple early, and you mentioned Waukesha. You generally expected the Schimel campaign had to come in the mid-60s. That's where Republicans have to come into Waukesha, because Waukesha, Ozaukee, and Washington counties, the WOW counties around Milwaukee, that balances off the big turnout in Dane County that Democrats traditionally do. And at Dane County, it went 80-20 for Crawford. So he needed that balance out of at least the WOW counties to start. I believe Judge Schimel was at 58-59% in Waukesha. The surprising one to me was Ozaukee, where for the longest time it was a 50-50 kind of count. And I think she actually won it by a little bit more, and Schimel did very well in Washington County. But then you go up the valley and get up to Brown County, the Bow counties now. So we have Brown and Outagamie and Winnebago. And those are counties that Republicans need to do well in. We watched how Brown County came in not particularly strong, and when Green Bay came in, Judge Crawford won the county. So then, I don't know if you could look at other places, but there were other spots like Racine and Kenosha did not come in for Republicans like it had. In fact, she won both. Mm-hmm. And then we looked at Dane County with that expectation, but going west of Dane County, between La Crosse County and Dane, there was always Republican performance in those counties. This time it was solid blue from Dane all the way to La Crosse. So when you looked at it's just the colorization, we can get into all sorts of what the percentages were, but you started to see this pattern where Judge Crawford exceeded the 23 vote for Judge Protasiewicz at the time, and then you started to see her outperform Kamala Harris in some cases from 2024. So at that point, I think it was becoming apparent that Judge Schimel early on said he needed 60% of the MAGA vote. So the strategy, like Joe Murray says, the strategy there was a high-risk strategy of throwing all the marbles in for that MAGA vote that Schimel needed to win, and it didn't work.
Fascinated too, if you have any kind of nuanced take on this. We've seen, it looks like perhaps some rebuilding from both sides of the aisle, right? Democrats and liberals very frustrated post-November, losing in a state like Wisconsin. And then conservatives, Republicans, losing this court race among a handful of others in recent years. Obviously, there's a top-line winner, right? Crawford won that election. When we look kind of deeper into it, the ground games, for example, are there any other kind of winners or light winners? Like, did the Democratic ground game, was that a winner on Tuesday? Or Republican conservative messaging, was that a winner on Tuesday at all?
Well, there's clearly a realignment that's been going on, not only nationwide, but in Wisconsin. I mean, you look at the 24 elections, you look at the last spring election, this one, and what's coming up. There's a realignment. And how and why does that break down? First of all, we had 500,000 voters come to this race that had not been here 2 years ago. They likely weren't new. So you have to then look and give credit, I think, to both campaigns. Everybody knew what they were going to do. The Democrats had to turn out Democrats on a revenge vote. Very simple. That's the ground game. That's what it takes. They had their structure and how they were reaching. Republicans went to kind of the outside forces of Turning Point and AFP and some others to go knock on doors and turn them out. They used the president's endorsement of Schimmel to try and motivate people to vote. So the answer is their turnout mechanisms were successful. However, it's apparent that there were not enough MAGA voters that came to vote for Judge Schimmel, and the Democrats overperformed in most areas that they needed to, and some areas that they didn't. So there was a heavy turnout. Both campaigns engaged in it. You got a winner, so you have to give the Judge Crawford the prize for turning out more voters, and it wasn't just a few voters here and there. But it's not as though either campaign didn't know what they had to do. It's just a question of how do you execute that. But there were some other factors in this race that may have played for one side's favor and the other. $100 million worth of advertising. Did it change anybody's minds? Maybe early on. We knew from the Marquette University Law School poll 3-4 weeks out that the candidates weren't particularly well known. They didn't have particularly high favorable ratings because of the negative advertising. But as time went on and money was spent, obviously their name ID went up. But probably negative by both. They weren't terribly favorable. So that drew attention to the race. And in these spring elections, when we used to sit around and have 20% turnout to go to 50% turnout, that's a big wow factor. Yeah. Other things. So the money was a factor. Even Stephen. I think the candidates, had their thing. But the big bull in the china shop here was Elon Musk. Yeah. And what did Musk do to this race? During the campaign, it was kind of hard to assess. Everybody knew he spent $20 million. Everybody knew he was engaged as an advocate on behalf of President Trump. But as the campaign moved toward the end, you have to step back and think, all right, did he take away from the Schimmel campaign and it become part of the race? Or, did he offer all sorts of advantages in addition to the money that he spent, which is probably now up to like $25 million? On the flip side, did his presence and his advocacy and his he was all over. I mean, you couldn't miss it. Did that and was that used to drive Democrats to vote against Trump? Because Musk was the Trump foil here. He was in place of Trump. To the Schimmel campaign's credit, I think not having President Trump here in a rally or other, saving that endorsement till the end, I think was a smart move. Had it come earlier, it might have even pushed Democrats harder. But still, they pulled 10 points out of it. And at some point, you have to sit back and say, should Musk have stepped back? If you're running a campaign, well, it's the candidate who's out there first. And always. It's your candidate, it's the message, that's what people focus on. When you go off that plan and there's something else out there that takes away from that priority of your campaign, there's consequences. And maybe in this case, Musk's way heavy, spending and presence and all the things that he did, maybe that pulled away some of the votes that Schimmel might have got and added incentive to Democrats to turn out to vote.
Well, fascinating. We'll get more into kind of the players in a second. I also want to ask you, too, what it's like when we've seen these negative underwater favorabilities for these two parties, how you have to run a campaign with that context. Brandon Schulz will be right back with you from the state capitol after this. Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation here in the state capitol of everything that went on with this spring's election with our political analyst, Brandon Schulz. Thanks for staying with us. Appreciate it. So I want to get to something that you were talking about before the break, this Trump endorsement. It came really late in the campaign. We saw him endorse, he didn't come to Wisconsin, but we saw his Trump ally, Elon Musk, come to Wisconsin, told that rally in Green Bay. To that point of like how meaningful, how useful it was for that national and then Trump-aligned Republican conservative attention to this race. To what extent was that useful?
Well, we knew that this race was nationalized. You know, it was a strategy to go out national, whether it was fundraising and bringing in all sorts of resources for the Republican side. Whether the Democrats had to do that, we didn't know for sure. But the Schimmel campaign had to decide how to use these assets and resources. When to use the president's endorsement? Do you bring him in for a rally? In the same respect, how did the Crawford campaign use an Obama endorsement? Was it high profile or was it, what they needed to do? But on the Republican side, they used that high risk strategy of what do we do with Trump? What do we do with that endorsement? And it was all designed to bring in MAGA voters. That's what they needed. There was no question how this was going to work. They weren't going to win with just the few Republicans there. So they had to get not only the MAGA reporters, but the voters, Republicans who were in the last election. And then you kind of overlay that with all of Musk's activities and whether or not that was going to be successful. Did they have another path to get there? Probably not. I mean, Wisconsin, as we know, is such a partisan state. It's cut it right down the middle. 49 Republican, 49 Democrat, and a few of those independents in between. And that's who decides elections, at least in the general. So in this case, we thought for the longest time that it would be a close race because nobody knew the candidates. They had low name ID, and as the campaign was moving up and money was being spent and negative ads were there, generally you think that as a negative ad gets put on, if you put the ad on, your unfavorables are going to raise, but you're trying to knock your candidate down. So it was, with $100 million of negative advertising, give or take a few shekels, you figured everybody was going to take it on the chin. So at what point did each campaign say we could take as many body blows up to this point? So one side has to say this is what we're going to do with Trump and Musk, and the other side says this is what we're going to do to motivate our voters.
I do want to also touch on this idea. Marquette Law School this week put out their national poll, but the numbers kind of mirror both nationally and what we see here in Wisconsin. Democrats are far underwater, almost 2-1, but yet liberals won the spring election. How do you, I don't know if this is too simple, but how do you do that? How, if your negatives are so high, you're so underwater, how are you able to drive voters to turn out like that?
It's interesting because these are this Supreme Court is a nonpartisan election, but it clearly was a partisan election. Yeah. And Democrats drove their voters to the poll using Donald Trump. But like the Democrats across the country, and as you mentioned, their results and where their people are, I mean, they're in the woods. They're trying to find a way out. But I would say after this election and the previous two Supreme Court elections that Republicans were not successful in, as well as a few other statewide races for governor and Senate, it's probably time to sit down and punch the reset button. What do you have to do as a political party, whether in the state or the county or nationally? What do you have to do to reset? Because you just can't ignore a 10-point loss. You had a good candidate, you had plenty of money, most things were even going in. Everybody, both candidates had negatives that, they're never going to go away. But as a party, what does the Republican Party Wisconsin do to make that change? And it's fair to say it's a Trump party. I mean, they're dominated by Trump folks, and in throughout their county parties. But what are they going to have to do to change things up to be ready not only for the next judicial race, but the midterms in November of 2026? That's the question, because if you can't change it by then, you're going to go into another election and where can you be successful? Maybe there's baby steps to get there, but they're going to have to go in the room, close the door, and scream at each other and figure out what's going to happen when they come out. And when you're in this sort of situation, this isn't a hit on Wisconsin, but when you're in this sort of situation, you have to make some changes, because if you just say, hey, look, we did the best we could. Okay, you did. But you lost by 10 points. And you can't ignore that fact. So there's some hard thinking, some hand-wringing, some gnashing of teeth, some, oh my God moments. But at some point, there's not much time. They're going to have to figure out what to do.
Well, we'll look ahead to 2026, all the races to come in just a second. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back. We're breaking down this week's Supreme Court election in the state capitol here with our political analyst, Brandon Schulz. And yeah, thanks for staying with us. Appreciate it. The other thing we were talking about, the kind of the caliber and the quality of the candidates, they have to wear two hats, right? They have to be kind of the scholarly, robed up, judicial mind, but then also hit the campaign trail. One of the things that struck me from this past cycle was people would reach out to me and say, I didn't know Brad Schimel was in a band. And so on election night, he plays bass. He was rocking out to his band there. It struck me, it seemed like both sides probably had good candidates this time around. Do you have a sense of what we might see in 2026 especially?
Yeah, recruiting people to run, especially in open seats, is difficult because you have to look at their record. You have to figure out what assets they have. Are they, I think Brad Schimel was a good retail candidate. He had experience running as Attorney General, so he was not new to walking into a room full of people and shaking hands and saying hello and giving speeches. And Judge Crawford may have not had as much of that experience, but still a good speaker and campaign. So you have to take all of those things into consideration whether you're considering running or whether you're trying to recruit people to run. So we have to see how the election will be set up in 2026 and what the incumbent will do and be like, how that's going to work. And you're sitting on a 4-3 court, 4 majority liberal justices, 3 conservatives. Will we have a race like that? Maybe you won't have a race. Maybe somebody will say, we have the majority. Doesn't matter if we win or lose, we still have the majority. So that call hasn't been made yet, but they only got 259 days. In fact, they probably have less than that. Maybe they have half that to recruit a candidate, build a campaign, raise money, put an organization together, do all the research. Remember in this race, Brad Schimel announced very, very early in the race. So he was
like
running
last October.
Way early. And that was, again, another strategic decision to put him in a position where he wasn't trying to let everybody know who he was 2 months, out from the election. So it's going to be different. The dynamics are different, but with this race in the background, that kind of sets the stage.
So not only will we have that spring election next year, spring 2026, but we'll have that fall election too. Governor Evers will be on the ballot if he decides to run again. This will also be kind of post that state budget cycle that we're going through now. Republicans have said we want to wait and see kind of what some of the Supreme Court current cases might ferret out to be before we pass that budget. How will this election kind of shape both that budget and then the fall election too?
That's a lot to throw in the blender.
I know, yeah.
So if you say, okay, we do need to sit back and wait a little bit on the spring election on judicial race. But looking forward to the fall elections, there's some things that are, not new to the race. Obviously, will Governor Evers run for re-election? And if he does, that sets the course in one way. If he doesn't, then it's open primary on the Democrat side. Who will the Republicans put up? And I think maybe people were waiting to see how this election turned out before they made that decision. But at some point, you'll start to see those people make decisions on running for governor and the statewide offices. The other one to watch is an issue that came from this election, the judicial election, and that is what will the court do on redistricting? Because one of the issues that came up was the Democrats said, we need to win because we need to change the lines in the first and third so we can win those Republican seats and make them Democrat seats. It's Hakeem Jeffries and Eric Holder and all those people that said this is what we're going to do. So the pressure is on the Supreme Court to do that issue. Now they need a lawsuit to talk about. It hasn't happened, but I'm sure there'll be one come, tomorrow and Monday morning. It'll be right there. If that happens, do you have then new congressional seats, and if it doesn't happen, you're operating on the same congressional lines that you had before. So you have governor's race and statewide constitutionals. You have congressional races that could or could not change the lines. But we also have lines that have been changed for the state Senate and the state Assembly. The state Assembly has been through one election with their new districts. In the state Senate, only half of those state senators went through the election last time. So you have a new set of elections in 26 for the state Senate. Republicans have 1 seat. And so if they win, then they maintain their majority. If they lose, then the Democrats have majority control of the state Senate. They could possibly have the executive branch, and they have the majority in the Supreme Court. And so as we look around the Capitol here, the 3 branches of government, the murals that they have up at the ceiling, you might see a blend of the executive and the legislative and the judicial branches be aligned philosophically, ideologically, and maybe on some issues.
in a way that we haven't seen since the Walker years, or for liberals and Democrats since early Jim Doyle. Is that right?
Let's go get some blue books and figure out what that was. I mean, it's been a while, and even when we go back and find that out, I think the difference politically in Wisconsin then to what it is now is completely different. Completely different.
To that state senate election, to the ground game, basically, right? We've seen liberals and Democrats win a handful of these most recent elections, notwithstanding November of 2024. Is that the same ground game? Is this a good sign for Democrats heading into 2026?
Well, for both sides, the opportunity to run your game, the opportunity to put it in motion, and then the opportunity after the election to decide what worked and what did is really important. So in that sense, both sides ran a ground game. They can decide what worked and what did. They can then apply it to not only the next spring election, but how that's going to play into 2026. So you have a number of things. You have issues that are going to come up. You have a ground game that we know is super important. It turned out an extra 500,000 people in this election. You know money is going to be there. Money is no object anymore in politics. And so who should be surprised if the governor's race is $100 million? You have candidates that you have to, the Republicans are going to have to recruit candidates to put up if Evers runs for election. If he doesn't, then, you have a wide open Democrat Party. So a lot of uncertainty and variables, but we still know what happens in the fall election in 2026. We know what races are going to be there. We know how Wisconsin is positioned as a purple state, 50-50. You know what you have to work with. They've had the spring election now, the spring election next year to see where people are going, and, we're going to be at the top of everybody's list because nobody's going to fly over Wisconsin.
Well, that's good. We will appreciate that.
Yeah.
We appreciate you, Brandon Schulz.
Thanks for having
so much
me.
for joining us. We'll be right back after this. That does it for us this week. Thanks for joining us here in the state capitol. I'm Will Keneally. Have a great rest of your weekend.
This has been For the Record.